In this video, we will be going through the process of creating a data analysis template that can be used to analyze the results for a piece of assessment, whether that's an in-class assignment, unit test, or cumulative assessment. Before you go to create a data analysis template in Excel, you'll need to choose the piece of assessment for which you want to create it. I've chosen an in-class assignment for grade 9 mathematics on Unit 5 polynomials. The information I'll need about the assessment is a total number of marks contained in the assessment, how many of those are constructed response marks, and how many of those are selected response marks. Once I have this information and the title of the assessment, I can then begin to create the Excel sheet. So what I'll need to do is open my Excel. And what I want to use in here is a blank workbook. Once you have your blank workbook open, you'll then want to give your worksheet or workbook a title. I'm going to call mine Unit 5 Polynomials in-class assignment. Now I'm going to bold that text as well as increase the size to a font size of about 20. So now I've got a nice clear heading and I know what this workbook will be addressing. What I then want to do is add some color to the workbook just so it becomes easier to read once I start putting more information in here. So I'm going to select the first few rows. Go over far enough so we know we have plenty of room to work with. And I'm going to use the paint can here below the font and choose some gradient scheme of color to organize the workbook. Personal preference here, for me, I really like the green accent, so I'm going to choose the green. What I want to do then is start modifying the width of some of my cells so that I can input data without having to worry about values being lost or names being cut off. The first column I'm going to use, or going to need, is the column for student names. So I'm going to take column A here. I'm actually going to extend that over so it's now about 3 cells in width. And I'm going to call this student name. The next heading I'm going to need here is for my selected response. Now if you recall, I had 15 selected response items. So what I'm going to need to do next is put in the numbers 1 through 15 in my Excel sheet. So what I've done here is now I've labeled my selected response items. I also know that I've got 15 marks for constructed response. And those 15 marks are distributed among 1, 2, 3, 4 questions. So I'll need to add in numbers 16, 17, 18, and 19. So I'm now going to put some headings above these. I'll label my selected response there. And I know that these 4 over here are my constructed response. Again, I like to bold these just because they become easier to read, and you can even upsize the font a little bit by clicking on this A if you want. And I'll be doing the same for the numbers. So we've got 2 separate headings here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to highlight these 2 cells, and I'm going to change the color on those. You don't have to, but I like to keep them separate. So now I can see there's my title, there's my student name, and here's my selected and constructed response items. The average class has between 15 and 20 students, so I'm going to leave 15 or 20 rows here depending. I'll choose 20 for the purpose of this video. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Right below that, what I want to do now is create some kind of separation between where I'll be inputting data and where I'll be analyzing data. So I'm going to select 5 or 6 rows here. And once again, I'm going to use that paint can to just give it a different color. You can choose whatever you like here. I'll go with a light blue. So now that we've got the basic structure created, what we'll need to do now is create a mechanism that we can use to analyze data once we've had the opportunity to correct our assessment and find out how students did. So what I'll need to do is first of all determine a way to tell Excel if a student has a selected response item correct or not. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to assign a value of 1 to each cell in this selected response area. I'll explain why I'm doing that momentarily. So the way I do that is I'm going to put a 1 in here in this cell, and what I can do, instead of having to type a 1 in every cell, is I can click this small square in the bottom right hand corner of the selected cell, and you'll see I get a black cross as opposed to the normal cursor. Once I get that, I'll take that and drag it across all of my selected response items all the way to 15. And you'll see what it does is it copies that entry into every cell in that row. I can then do the same thing by dragging that selection downward across the rest of the selected response items. So now you'll see I have a 1 in every cell underneath the selected response section of my data analysis template. And personal preference for me is to have those centered. The reason we've put a 1 in each cell is that's going to tell Excel whether or not the student got the answer correct. If the student got the answer correct, we will be leaving a 1 here. If the student didn't get the answer correct, we'll be putting in their incorrect response, and we'll be telling Excel how to count incorrect responses as well as correct ones. The first piece of information I'd like to analyze once I start inputting data is how many students got each selected response item correct. So I'll be concerned about the total number of correct answers. And again, I'll like to bold those, and I think I'll center them as well. So the way I do that is I want to count how many 1s are here. In other words, I only want to count the value in the cell if it's 1. If it's anything else, it's an incorrect response, and I don't want it to be considered. So the way I do that is I'll click on the cell below, and I'm going to use the count if statement. So the count if statement has 2 arguments. We'll need to specify a range and then provide it with a criteria so it knows whether or not it can count a value in the cell. So the range I'm going to choose is the column directly above that cell. And this is the responses by students to selected response item number 1. I'm then going to separate the range from the criteria with a comma, and I'll need to place my criteria in quotation marks. Now, the criteria I want is that the value of the cell be 1. So I'm actually going to put in a criteria that the cell be equal to 1. So I can put a digit 1, or the 1's digit, inside 2 quotation marks and hit enter. And what you'll see is that it returns a value of 20. And you'll notice that we left 20 blanks earlier because our class size in this case is 20 students. When I colored this bottom section, what you'll notice is that I lost a lot of this nice separation between cells. I lost the lines. So what I'd like to do is add those back. The way I do that is I just drag my mouse over this section I've colored blue. So once I have that highlighted, I can then change the way it looks. And I can change the way it looks by using this small box right up here in the font section. So I'm going to click the drop menu. And I actually want to see every cell separately, so I'm going to put in all the borders. Just like were present before, I'd like to have them back. So now we get a nice separation between the cells, which means it'll be easy to see the values. Back to tabulating the results, what I'd like to do is have this count for every selected response item. So again, the way I can do that is I can use this small square, and I can drag that calculation across over the 15 selected response items, and it will automatically change the range needed in that calculation so it uses the column directly above. So now we were able to see how many students have got each selected response item correct. The next piece of information we'd like to know is what distractors did students choose? So we'd like to know the total number of A's, the total number of B's, the total number of C's, and the total number of D's chosen by students as distractors. I'm going to bold those and center them. So as I mentioned earlier, Excel will only now count this as a correct answer if the value is 1. Meaning that if I was looking at selected response item number 1 and the answer is C, then I would just, and student 1 answers C, I would leave this as a value of 1. If the student were to answer A, but the correct answer was C, I would then need to input their incorrect answer. So what we end up doing is only putting in incorrect answers from students. We don't need to fill out every single multiple choice item or selected response item. We only need to input incorrect answers. But I need to tell Excel that it needs to count the A's, count the B's, the C's, and the D's. So I'll use the same method I used to count the correct answers. Before I wanted to count them only if they were 1. Well, now I want to count them only if they're A. So I'm going to use the count if statement once again, and I'm going to specify the same range I did before. The difference here now is that I'm using the letter A as opposed to a digit of 1, because it will now count an answer of A if a student incorrectly answered A. So just to show you what I mean, if I put A in for student 1, we'll see that now only 19 got this question correct, and the one person who did get it wrong chose an answer of A. And I want to do the same thing for the B's. So again, I'm going to use a count if statement, specify the same range, but I will now use the criteria that it has to be a B. I'll do the same thing for the values for C. Again, I'll use a count if statement, but the criteria, it has to be C. And once again, I'll use that count if statement, specify the criteria and the range that we'll look to find D's. So as I did previously, I won't need to type this into every cell. I need to only type it once. And once it's there in my sheet, I click on that small square and drag that calculation across. So what I've done now is I've created an area that will analyze how many A's were chosen for each item, how many B's, how many C's, and how many D's. And for consistency, I also want to center these as well. So now I've got enough information to analyze my selected response. What I want to do now is I want to move on to my constructed response. In the constructed response section of the exam, we won't actually have to input any values before we start analyzing the data. What that means is that we won't be counting values of 1 or 2. What we'll need to do is specify point values and find out, well, what was the class average on that assessment item. So if question 16 is worth 2 marks, what was the average students attained? Did they attain that class average of 1.8 out of 2 or 1.5 out of 2? How do we do that? Well, what we want to do is create an average column down bottom here. So I'm going to choose the very bottom cell, and I'm going to call this average. And again, I'll bold and center that. So if I want the average of my constructed response item 16, I'm going to now use command average and open a bracket. And what I'll need to do then is select a range of values to average. And I'm going to select the range of values for my 20 students and hit enter. And right now you'll see that it says dividing by 0. That's okay, and it does that because there aren't any values in here right now. If I were to put in a value of 2 here and 3 here and 2 and so on, you'll see that it begins averaging them. So it'll only count items that have a point value. That also means that if a student were to get 0 on an assessment item, we would need to input the 0. If not, it would not be included into the average. And I want that average calculated, once again, for all 4 constructed response items, so I drag that calculation across. So now we've got enough done that we can analyze our selected response, we can analyze our constructed response, but what we'd like to do now is find out and determine how many selected responses did each student get right, what value did they achieve out of 15 on the constructive response, and also what was their percentage score, or mark as we'd like to call it, on their exam or piece of assessment. So I'll give 3 headings here. Selected response, I've denoted with SR, constructed response is CR, and the percent average with a percent sign. So for the selected response, once again, what I'll need is to find out how many 1s they got over here, because 1s denote correct answers. So once again, I'll be using the COUNTIF statement. But the criteria that I'll be specifying this time is constructed response items, selected response items 1 to 15. And the criteria I want here once again is that it has to be equal to 1 if it's going to be a correct answer. So what we see now is, because by default these are all 1, student 1 right now would have a perfect score on the selected response section of the exam. That will only change if they score incorrect answers and we put them in. For the constructed response, all I'll need is the sum. Because I have a maximum of 15 marks in constructed response, all I need is to find out how many marks a student achieved out of 15. So I can do that by simply adding the totals for the point value achieved on the 4 constructed response items on my assessment. And right now we can see that because there were no point values inputted, we have a constructed response score of 0. The last calculation we'll want to make here is what was their percent score on the exam. Well, just like we would do if we were doing this with pen and paper, we'd add up the selected response and constructed response, and then we'd divide by the total number of marks on the exam. We'll do the same thing in this cell. So I'm going to add the selected response to the constructed response. I'll then divide that by the total number of marks, which is 30, and then multiply that answer by 100 to obtain a percent. And in this case, because we've got 0 on constructed response, 15 on the selected response, the student achieves a value of 50. What I'd now like to do again is use that small square and extend those calculations for students 1 through 20. And again, what I'd like to do is center those numbers, just to be consistent. The last thing I'd like here is I'd like to know the averages. I'd like to know how students performed as a whole or as a class on the assessment items on their exam. So I'm going to create a section called averages, which will average my selective response, my constructive response, and this class percentage. So again, I'm going to use that average command. So I'll have an equal sign, average, and I'll then need to select my 20 students, and I'll hit enter. So you'll see that because everybody got 15, we didn't input any incorrect answers yet. The average for that column is 15. We'll also see that the average for my constructive response is 0, and we'll see that the average for the class is 50 right now, because once again, we haven't input any data. Once you have this done, you're now ready to start entering data, inputting incorrect student answers, and identifying areas of concern. If you have a class of 7 or a class of 5 or a class of 23, all you would need to do is, as opposed to putting 20 rows into this spreadsheet, we would just include the total number of students. I hope you find this helpful. And enjoy your data analysis.